Before Hollywood learned that mocking a legend has consequences, the entire industry thought they could humiliate Clint Eastwood at their most prestigious awards show. This is the story of how one man's dignity silenced thousands and reminded the world what real class looks like. He's just a relic of the past. The whispers of Hollywood's elite spread through the Dolby Theater. On the night of the 2020 Academy Awards, the entire industry had decided to make Clint Eastwood the subject of mockery. Stage jokes, humiliating comments, degrading remarks. It was all planned, but none of them calculated that Clint would stand up and take the microphone. Because sometimes the quietest man makes the loudest statement. 3 weeks before the 2020 Academy Awards ceremony, an unusual meeting took place in a private dining room at Soho House in West Hollywood. Around the table sat some of the most influential people in the entertainment industry, prominent producers, A-list actors, network executives, and the ceremony's host. The agenda was unofficial but clear: how to handle the Clint Eastwood problem. At 90 years old, Clint had been selected as a presenter for the Best Picture category, an honor typically reserved for industry legends. But in the new Hollywood, legends were becoming liabilities. His traditional values, his outspoken political views, and his refusal to embrace the industry's progressive transformation had made him a target. Some saw him as an embarrassment to modern cinema. "We need to handle this carefully," said Marcus Webb, the ceremony's executive producer. "We can't disinvite him. The backlash would be enormous, but we can't let him have a platform either." The solution they devised was subtle but devastating: death by 1,000 cuts. No single moment of outright disrespect, but a consistent pattern of diminishment throughout the evening. The plan was methodical. The host would make gentle but pointed jokes about old Hollywood during the opening monologue. Presenters would reference outdated filmmaking styles. Social media influencers in attendance would post strategically timed content questioning whether certain actors were still relevant. The goal was to create a narrative that Clint Eastwood was a relic, a symbol of everything Hollywood had evolved beyond. Young actors were briefed to avoid being photographed with him. Producers were advised to skip the traditional backstage meet and greets. Even the seating arrangement was designed to isolate him, placed far from the main action, surrounded by lesser-known industry figures rather than his peer group of established legends. The most insidious part of the plan was its deniability. If confronted, everyone could claim it was coincidental, or worse, suggest that Clint was being paranoid or overly sensitive. It was the perfect Hollywood takedown, subtle, systematic, and designed to appear organic. But what the conspirators failed to consider was that Clint Eastwood had survived in Hollywood for over 6 decades, not through luck, but through an acute understanding of human nature. He had faced down studio executives, demanding directors, and difficult co-stars. He had navigated the transition from contract player to superstar to respected filmmaker. The idea that a group of industry insiders could manipulate him without his knowledge was their first mistake. The night of the ceremony arrived with all the usual glamour and spectacle, but beneath the surface, a different kind of drama was about to unfold. The Dolby Theater glittered with its usual Oscar night splendor as Hollywood's finest gathered for the industry's most prestigious celebration. Red carpet interviews buzzed with excitement, but careful observers might have noticed something unusual. Very few people were mentioning Clint Eastwood, despite his role as a presenter for the evening's most important award. The ceremony began with host Trevor Williams delivering his opening monologue to thunderous applause. The jokes came fast and sharp, targeting politicians, recent scandals, and industry trends. But then came the moment the conspirators had planned for. "It's wonderful to see so many legends here tonight," Williams said with a perfectly practiced smile. "Some of them have been making movies since movies were in black and white. Speaking of which, we should probably check if they know how color film works now." The audience laughed, many assuming it was just generic old Hollywood humor. But those in the know understood the target. Clint, sitting in his assigned seat, showed no reaction. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were watchful. As the evening progressed, the subtle mockery continued. When presenting the Cinematography Award, a young actress made a point of praising modern filmmaking techniques that have evolved far beyond the simple storytelling of previous eras. During a montage celebrating film history, Clint's iconic scenes were notably brief compared to other legends, and several of his most acclaimed directorial works were omitted entirely. The whispers in the audience were becoming more noticeable. During commercial breaks, clusters of young stars and industry insiders would glance toward Clint's section and exchange knowing looks. Social media was already lighting up with posts from attendees making subtle digs about outdated masculinity and toxic nostalgia. When Clint was finally called to present Best Picture, the applause was polite, but noticeably lukewarm compared to other presenters. As he walked to the stage, his movement was slower than it once was, and some in the audience exchanged glances that seemed to say, "This is exactly our point." The teleprompter displayed his scripted introduction, designed to be brief and unremarkable. He was supposed to simply read the nominees, announce the winner, and exit. Standard presenter protocol. The producers in the booth were congratulating themselves on a perfectly executed plan. But as Clint reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces before him, something shifted. Instead of immediately reading from the teleprompter, he paused. He placed his hands on either side of the podium and took a long, deliberate look around the theater. The pause stretched longer than comfortable. In the control room, producers began to fidget. This wasn't in the script. The silence in the Dolby Theater stretched uncomfortably as Clint Eastwood stood at the podium, his weathered hands gripping the sides, his piercing blue eyes scanning the audience. What was supposed to be a quick presenter introduction had become something else entirely. The teleprompter scrolled its scripted words, but Clint wasn't reading them. In the control booth, executive producer Marcus Webb leaned forward anxiously. "What's he doing?" he whispered to his assistant. This was live television, and any deviation from the script could be disastrous. The camera operators, unsure of what to focus on, kept their lenses trained on Clint's face. The audience began to shift restlessly. The initial assumption that this was just an old man struggling with the teleprompter was giving way to something more uncomfortable. Those who had been part of the evening's subtle campaign against Clint suddenly felt exposed under his steady gaze. "You know," Clint finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the theater's sound system, "I've been coming to these ceremonies for over 50 years. He paused again, letting that sink in. 50 years of watching this industry change, evolve, grow. And tonight, sitting out there, listening to all the speeches, all the jokes, all the whispered conversations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several audience members exchanged nervous glances. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be a standard presenter moment. I couldn't help but notice something," Clint continued, his tone conversational, but carrying an undertone that made everyone lean forward. "There seems to be a misunderstanding about what this industry is built on." Trevor Williams, the host, was visible in the front row, his earlier confidence replaced by visible concern. The jokes he had made during the opening monologue suddenly felt different in retrospect. Less clever, more cruel. In the audience, young actors who had been posting dismissive social media content throughout the evening quietly began putting their phones away. The atmosphere was shifting, and they could feel it. What had started as an evening of subtle mockery was transforming into something that felt increasingly like a reckoning. Clint's presence at the podium was commanding in a way that transcended his age. This wasn't a frail old man struggling with technology or stumbling through a script. This was someone who had commanded film sets for decades, who had stared down some of the toughest people in Hollywood, who had built a career on never backing down from a fight. "I think," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 6 decades in the business, "it's time we had an honest conversation." What happened next would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform and analyzed by cultural commentators for years to come. Clint Eastwood, abandoning the scripted presenter role entirely, delivered 3 minutes of unscripted truth that cut through the veneer of Hollywood politeness like a blade. "This industry," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word, was built by people who understood that respect isn't something you lose when you turn 60, 70, or 90. It's something you earn through decades of showing up, doing the work, and treating people with dignity. The camera captured the faces in the audience with unflinching clarity. Some looked defiant, others increasingly uncomfortable. A few appeared genuinely ashamed. Tonight, I've watched an entire generation of performers and executives congratulate themselves on their moral superiority while displaying the exact opposite of the values they claim to champion. His words landed with surgical precision. You've spent this evening making jokes about the past, dismissing traditions, mocking the very foundations that gave you the platform you're standing on. The silence was absolute now. Even the production team had stopped trying to cut away or interrupt. They understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. You want to talk about progress? Real progress isn't tearing down everything that came before you. It's building on it. It's understanding that wisdom doesn't expire just because it comes from someone with gray hair. Clint's gaze moved across the theater, seeming to make eye contact with everyone who had participated in the evening's subtle campaign against him. I've made over 60 films in my career. I've worked with actors who are no longer with us, directors who shaped this industry, writers who understood that storytelling isn't about messaging. It's about truth. And the truth is, respect goes both ways. The audience was completely still. Many were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had participated in and how it looked now under the harsh light of Clint's response. You can disagree with my politics, my movies, my methods. That's your right. But what you can't do is pretend that disrespect is progress, that mockery is sophistication, or that tearing someone down makes you more enlightened. He paused, letting his words settle over the stunned audience. Now, he said, his tone shifting back to something resembling normalcy. I believe I'm supposed to present an award. The transition was masterful. In less than 3 minutes, he had completely reframed the evening, called out the industry's behavior, and reminded everyone what dignity looked like. And he had done it all without raising his voice, without personal attacks, and without losing his composure. The immediate aftermath of Clint's speech was unlike anything in Academy Awards history. As he presented the Best Picture award to Parasite, the applause was different, louder, more sustained, and tinged with something that felt like collective shame. The audience was clapping not just for the film, but as a form of apology for the evening they had orchestrated. Backstage, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several young actors who had participated in the evening's social media mockery were frantically deleting posts. Producers who had been part of the original conspiracy were suddenly unavailable for comment when entertainment reporters began asking questions about the evening's unusual tone. Marcus Webb, the executive producer who had orchestrated much of the subtle campaign against Clint, found himself in crisis management mode. The ceremony was still ongoing, but social media was already exploding with reactions to Clint's unscheduled speech. The hashtag number #RespectClint began trending within minutes, followed quickly by #HollywoodShame. The most telling reaction came from the industry veterans in attendance. Actors like Meryl Streep, Robert De Niro, and Helen Mirren, legends in their own right who had remained silent during the evening's subtle mockery, were now seen seeking out Clint during commercial breaks, offering handshakes and quiet words of support. The split-screen effect was dramatic. On one side, established legends recognizing what had just happened and showing their respect. On the other, younger industry figures scrambling to distance themselves from behavior they were only now beginning to understand the implications of. Entertainment journalists in attendance began reframing their planned coverage. What was supposed to be another routine awards ceremony recap was now a major industry story about generational conflict and the way Hollywood treats its legends. The live television audience was massive, but the real explosion came after the ceremony ended and clips of Clint's speech began circulating online. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times across platforms. Comment sections were filled with people expressing shame at what they had witnessed, admiration for Clint's response, and criticism of an industry that would allow such treatment of one of its most accomplished figures. Perhaps most significantly, the speech sparked conversations that went far beyond Hollywood. It became a cultural moment about respect for elders, the value of experience, and the difference between progress and simply tearing down what came before. By the next morning, it was clear that the plan to marginalize Clint Eastwood had backfired spectacularly. Instead of diminishing his stature, the evening had reminded everyone exactly why he was a legend in the first place. In the days and weeks following the 2020 Academy Awards, the entertainment industry underwent what many observers called a moment of reckoning. Clint Eastwood's unscheduled speech had done more than defend his own dignity. It had forced an entire industry to confront its own behavior and values. The immediate consequences were swift and far-reaching. Marcus Webb, the executive producer who had orchestrated the subtle campaign against Clint, found his future projects under review. Several actors who had been part of the social media mockery issued public apologies, though many felt these came across as damage control rather than genuine remorse. More significantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation about how Hollywood treats its veterans. Industry organizations began implementing new protocols to ensure that legendary figures were treated with appropriate respect at industry events. The Academy itself issued a statement acknowledging that the evening had fallen short of the respect that all honorees deserve. Clint's speech became required viewing in film schools and communications programs across the country. It was studied not just as an example of effective public speaking, but as a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Students analyzed how he had managed to completely reframe a hostile situation without resorting to anger or personal attacks. The cultural impact extended far beyond Hollywood. The speech became a touchstone for discussions about ageism, respect for experience, and the value of listening to different perspectives. It was shared widely on platforms typically dominated by younger users, many of whom admitted they had never seen Clint's films, but found his message compelling. Perhaps most tellingly, several of Clint's films experienced a resurgence in popularity following the speech. Streaming services reported significant increases in viewership for his classic westerns and his directorial works. A new generation discovered his movies, many expressing surprise at their sophistication and relevance. For Clint himself, the aftermath was characteristically low-key. He declined most interview requests about the speech, preferring to let his words speak for themselves. When pressed by one persistent reporter, he simply said, "I said what needed saying." That's enough. The 2020 Academy Awards became known as the Eastwood moment, not for any film that won, but for a 3-minute unscheduled speech that reminded an industry and a culture about the difference between progress and simple destruction. It proved that sometimes the most powerful response to coordinated disrespect is not retaliation, but a calm, dignified reminder of what respect actually looks like. In an era of viral moments and trending hashtags, Clint Eastwood had created something more lasting, a reminder that character and dignity never go out of style. Have you ever witnessed someone transform mockery into respect through sheer dignity? Share your story in the comments below.
Don't forget to hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe if you want videos like this to come. See you in the next story.